In the world of gaming, one of the most integral aspects is a healthy gameplay loop. And in the brand new mode, Onslaught for Destiny 2, the question is, does it live up to the standards of a healthy gameplay loop, and does it live up to all the hype? Well, in this video, we're going to cover that and much more. That being said, if you want to see more educational Destiny 2 content like this, sci-fi content, and plenty more in the future, then be sure as always to like, comment, and subscribe. And let's get straight into the video. In Onslaught, we currently have 3 respective maps to choose from. We have Midtown, we have Vostok, and we have Mothyards. So in Midtown, let's kick things off with the pros and the cons. First thing, the pros. So what makes Midtown a great map to choose when it comes to, let's say, a normal wave or legendary waves as a whole? For one, Midtown is a lot smaller and more controlled in terms of its space when compared to the other respective maps. And that's a good thing, because knowing where enemies are likely to come from in terms of their choke points, in terms of just overall pressure, is easier on you when you now have a build that can easily sustain and survive for long periods of time. And because of that, you have more to work with. You know, if I know an enemy is likely to come from one specific choke point most of the time, because that's the only choke point that's available to them, it's easier for you to build around that and have weapons that can easily take out enemies. Let's say you have a grenade launcher with a wave frame. You now know how to deal with targets that run down the choke because you have a weapon or an option that can deal with enemies who immediately try to pursue you through that area. Also, one thing I do love is the spawn points in Midtown just feel more comfortable, and it's easier for you to navigate because of the simplicity of it. There's nothing too out there, if that makes any sense, when you compare it to other maps that have a little bit more space, which can be at times quite not overwhelming, but to some extent it takes away a level of focus because you have way more angles to pay attention to, whereas in Midtown those angles are limited. You only have so much to work with, and thus you have more in the sense of what you can really incorporate with your build strategy as well as your team strategy. Now, the con, of course, is that it's the same thing. Some people will not like the close quarters aspect of the map because they prefer more mid to long range, where they can really slow things down, focus on where targets are, and deal with them accordingly. And so if you're not a big fan of the high pressure, urgent, high alert scenario that is Midtown, then maybe this map isn't for you. But if this is something you love, if this is a map that really speaks to you because you're more of that close range type of player, or just you prefer that more in your face, that more action packed, really truly an Onslaught feel, then Midtown is definitely the way to go. And so out of 5, I gotta give Midtown a solid 4.5. I think it's a well-rounded map. It's not too big, it's not too small, it has just enough for you to work with, and it really does provide some great utility and great creativity in terms of your build loadouts. And so long as your team can coordinate to make sure every choke point is covered, making sure your ADU is secure, your decoys are in the right position, and you're saving your scraps, you should be good to go. So that being said, let's move on to the next point. Vostok plays somewhat of the middleman in that it takes some crucial parts or crucial elements of Midtown and combines it with the more, let's say, open-ended side of Mothyards, where you have more space to work with. Now, the space isn't vast like Mothyards is, but it's enough to where you can really take more initiative to explore weapon territory. When compared to that of Midtown, you want to be carrying weapons that can really deal with enemies quick. You want some fast rate of fire, you want something high impact, explosive, more dynamic, more hardcore, visceral. That's what Midtown kind of provides. Vostok takes some of that, and also sprinkle some of Mothyards in there, where you're still gonna have to really have your guard up. You're gonna have to focus because the spawn points are still very dangerous, and depending on the targets you're working with, whether it's a Fallen or it's a Hive, you're gonna have to change up your playstyle because every respective enemy is going to attack you differently. So Vostok's pros is that it combines the elements of what a hardcore horde mode feels like, but not to the extent to Midtown. It kind of gives you some leeway, some breathing room, if you will, to play more weapons. You have more of a weapon catalog to choose from, a larger weapon catalog to be more specific. So you can run maybe close range, more mid-range, more long range. Like, the options are more available to you because the angles that you're working with, the choke points you're working with, will encourage you to, let's say, run an AR or maybe run a scout rifle because the angle is long enough to where you can utilize it to pressure targets from afar. And then when they get close to you, you can go back to your sidearm or your hand cannon. And that pretty much kind of encapsulates that flow of what Vostok is. It's a nice, healthy middle ground. There's nothing that would feel too off-putting to the point where it's like crazy hype, crazy hardcore, like what Midtown brings, but it's not too slow like Mothyards is. So again, if you want a nice healthy balance between best of both worlds in that sense, Vostok is nice for you. And because of that, I would have to give Vostok a solid 4. It doesn't do anything great, but it also doesn't do anything bad. It's just right, if that makes any sense. It just feels right. So if I were to say a con for this, it would be that perhaps the map itself doesn't really cater to your style. I know a lot of players tend to favor the more, again, hardcore, rush down type of feel that Midtown brings, and I can see why, because it really feels more fitting to the name of Onslaught. Midtown really feels like an Onslaught map, whereas Vostok feels like an Onslaught map, but with a little bit more, again, breathing room to kind of, you know, strategize better and come up with more ideas to experiment in terms of weapons. So that being said, let's move on to the next point. Mothyards is the third and final map currently introduced into the Onslaught playlist, and so let's start with the pros themselves before we go into the cons. Now, the biggest pro, of course, is that Mothyards is way more open than that of the other respective maps, that being Midtown and Vostok. So if you're a big fan of things like scout rifles and snipers and ARs, then Mothyards definitely plays well into your particular style. Now, that isn't to say you can't use things like SMGs and sidearms, but the map itself is large enough to where you're able to play with a greater degree of freedom in terms of your loadout. And so if you're really a big fan of that open map where the momentum is not as chaotic as the other maps, then Mothyards certainly is a big pro for you because, again, comparatively speaking, this map, while the chaos is there, it's been toned down to the point where it doesn't feel as if you have to be super engaged with every enemy that you encounter. Now, granted, you have to engage, but it's not like a hardcore, oh my gosh, I gotta get this enemy down before Tormentor shows up, or oh my gosh, demolitionists on top of the spawn, or, it's not as condensed. So you have a little bit more breathing room, if that makes any sense, to make better decisions. So that's a pretty big pro, if I were to call it that. However, the con, or cons, is that the map is big. So while the pro itself is that the map is big, the con is that the map is big. And that's because Onslaught, at least from my experience of playing with other players in the community and just watching other streamers, I feel like Onslaught really by definition is a mode that's supposed to feel chaotic. It's supposed to give you that rush, that adrenaline rush of, enemies are just coming from different angles. What do you do about it? How do you control the scenario in a very condensed and closed, confined environment? So with Mothyards being so open and vast, it's easy to kind of dictate the flow, if you will, because you know that, okay, there are a bunch of fallen coming from the far left side of the map, and you can easily target them before they even get even close to your ADU. And also, when it comes to things like picking up batteries, I think that was perhaps the biggest con for me, was the travel time between me, let's say, destroying an enemy, running to grab the battery, and coming back to the base. Like that time period felt really long. And comparing to, let's say, Midtown or Vostok, where if I was to grab a battery, the battery would be usually right in front of the ADU. So it gave me a chance to grab, come back to base, and, you know, play that defensive mode. But I felt like if I ran off into the distance to grab a battery, by that time of me coming back, I feel like there's already an invasion coming, if you will. But also, it's just the momentum felt slower, and that to me kind of brought that hype down. And then of course, you're going into the pyramid, the hype itself is already somewhat slow, because I feel like the design aspect of the pyramid section, or the halfway point, is meant to slow down. It's meant to kind of give you a cool off period, help you to give you a little bit of a reset before the boss wave. And so when you pair that with the already slow momentum of Mothyards, and then going into the halfway point where it's already slow enough as it is, it just takes away from that rush that you feel. So for me, out of 5, Mothyards gets a 3. I'm not a huge fan of it. Initially I was, but again, over time I started to see the cracks, and I was like, I would much rather prefer to play on Midtown or Vostok, just for the chaos and that feeling of really playing together as a group, and really, you know, hunkering down and taking initiative right away. So that being said, let's move on to the next point. So my final thoughts on Onslaught, to be honest, are very positive. While Mothyards in itself isn't a map that I favor, that shouldn't take away from the entire experience of itself, that is Onslaught. And I have to say that when I'm playing this mode, I'm having a total blast. Like, really, truly, it's becoming one of my favorite modes to play in all of Destiny 2 right now. More so than GM Nightfalls or dungeons. Like, I've been recently trying to do more solo dungeon runs, and those have been awesome, by the way. And of course, check out my live stream, by the way, kick.com/newfrontier, and here on YouTube to catch me live doing those. And of course, Onslaught. But in the end, I think Onslaught to me feels like a breath of fresh air. It's a great mode that I think new lights can get into, as well as experienced players. And the wonderful part about it is that it really encourages you to think outside the box, to be creative with new builds, and just tinker with things that perhaps you never had a chance to tinker with before. Or maybe you just kind of ignored a weapon in the past, and now you bring it back out and it actually has value. So Onslaught to me, in the end, encapsulates fun in a nutshell. It's a fun mode, it's invigorating, it's exciting, it brings people together in a positive way. And out of 5, I've got to give Onslaught for sure a 4.5 out of 5. The enemies right now, of course, we only have the Hive and the Fallen currently in the playlist, but here's hoping they add in some more down the road. Personally, for me, I prefer to fight the Hives more than the Fallen, just because from experience, Fallen can be quite the irritation, for lack of a better word. You know, them teleporting left and right can be a bit of a hassle, while the Hive members tend to be a little bit more hard-hitting, but at least they don't teleport back and forth. So that's just my personal take. What do you folks think of Onslaught? Let me know in the comment section down below. And of course, as always, new warriors, stay strong, keep fighting, and may the force be with you all always. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.